Somewhere in Normandy, in the summer of 1944, a German military intelligence officer picked up a document that American forces had left behind. It was an operations order, a combat order, the kind of written document that told an attacking American unit exactly what it was supposed to do. These orders were captured from time to time, and a good intelligence officer always read them carefully because they revealed how the enemy planned, what they valued, how they thought about war. This officer read the order. Then he read it again. Then he turned the page over, looking for the rest of it. There was no rest of it. The entire order, the complete set of instructions for what was, by any measure, a significant military operation, fit on a single page. 5 short paragraphs, a situation summary, a mission, a direction, some administrative details, and almost nothing else. He reportedly described it to colleagues as looking like the work of an army that didn't know how to plan. He was not a foolish man. He was not an inexperienced one. He had trained in a military system that produced some of the most thoroughly detailed, precisely structured combat orders in the history of warfare. A German regimental attack order of the same period routinely ran 6 to 10 pages. Every movement of every unit was timed to the minute. Every contingency was mapped. Every what-if was addressed. It was a masterpiece of coordination, a thing of genuine planning craft. And it was the product of a military culture that had spent more than a century building exactly this kind of elaborate, interlocking system of command. Against that standard, 5 paragraphs looked thin. It looked unserious. It looked perhaps like evidence that the Americans were simply not very good at this. He was wrong about that, profoundly wrong, because that single page was not evidence of American sloppiness. It was the visible end product of a 17-year revolution in how the United States Army trained its officers to think, plan, and lead. A revolution that had begun with a humiliating defeat in the deserts of North Africa, been driven by one of the most quietly brilliant military reformers of the 20th century, and had produced, by the summer of 1944, an army whose junior officers and sergeants could do something that their German counterparts increasingly could not: make fast, independent, intelligent decisions without waiting for someone above them to tell them what to do. That single page was not weakness. It was a weapon, and the German High Command, for all its planning and precision, never fully understood what it was looking at until it was too late. This is the story of how the United States Army transformed the way it thought about command, leadership, and war, and how that transformation, invisible to almost everyone who didn't already understand it, helped decide the outcome of the greatest military campaign of the 20th century.
To understand what changed, you first have to understand what the United States Army was like before the change, and why that way of doing things made a certain kind of sense, even as it carried within it the seeds of its own eventual failure. The American military between the 2 world wars was, in most respects, a deeply conservative institution. This was not a failure of intelligence or character on the part of the men who ran it. It was rather a reflection of the particular lessons that military institutions tend to draw from the last war they fought, and the last war the American Army had fought in France between 1917 and 1918 had rewarded a specific set of virtues: discipline, standardization, meticulous coordination, and the careful step-by-step management of enormous concentrations of men and firepower. The American expeditionary forces of the First World War had arrived in France with minimal battlefield experience, and they had managed, in the end, to be effective largely because their senior commanders had built systems that were clear, standard, and reproducible. Systems that allowed a vast, recently assembled citizen army to function with at least reasonable efficiency even when individual units were inexperienced and officers were new to their jobs. From this experience, the interwar American Army drew certain conclusions about what good military organization looked like. It looked like detailed, standardized orders. It looked like clear chains of command, with information flowing up and decisions flowing down. It looked like precision and predictability, a system in which every soldier and every unit knew exactly what was expected of them at every moment because someone above them had thought it all out in advance and written it down. The problem with this approach, which would not become fully apparent until American forces encountered a genuine first-class enemy in combat, was a problem of friction. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing in the early 19th century, had identified what he called the fog of war, the irreducible uncertainty, confusion, and unpredictability that descends on any military operation the moment it makes contact with a real, thinking, reacting enemy. No plan, however carefully made, survives first contact with the enemy entirely intact. Things go wrong. Units arrive late. Unexpected resistance appears in unexpected places. Communication breaks down. The map turns out not to match the ground. In a military system built around detailed top-down orders, the fog of war created a specific and debilitating problem. When things went wrong, as they always did, junior officers at the platoon, company, and battalion level who had been trained to wait for orders from above were suddenly in situations their orders hadn't anticipated. Their instructions told them what to do if everything went according to plan. Nothing had gone according to plan, and so they waited. They asked for new orders. They hesitated. They did things by the book when the book no longer applied. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground was changing every minute. In mobile warfare, the fast, fluid, armor-heavy kind of fighting that the Second World War turned out to be, the difference between a unit that acted correctly in the next 30 seconds and a unit that waited for updated orders could be the difference between a position held and a position lost, between a gap exploited and a gap closed, between a battle won and a battle that ground on for days at enormous cost. The American Army, in the early 1930s, had one man who understood this problem with exceptional clarity, and he had just been given a small school in Georgia in which to begin, very quietly, doing something about it.
Let's step back to 1927 and to a sun-baked army post in Georgia called Fort Benning, home of the infantry school where the United States Army trained its infantry officers. And let's meet the man who, more than any other single individual, would remake the intellectual foundations of the American way of war. Lieutenant Colonel George C. Marshall had arrived at Fort Benning as its assistant commandant in 1927, and he was, by that point, a man who had already spent the better part of 15 years thinking about what had gone wrong in the previous war and what needed to be different about the next one. He had served as a key operational planner in France between 1917 and 1918. He had sat on the boards that reviewed what the American expeditionary forces had learned. He had watched in China, where he served in the mid-1920s as executive officer of a regiment, a young officer in a training exercise become completely unable to issue a simple set of movement orders to 70 men, paralyzed by the elaborate, process-heavy system the infantry school had taught him, unable to function when the situation required speed and improvisation rather than textbook procedure. That young officer had graduated first in class from the infantry school. Marshall had come away from the incident with, in his own words, an intense desire to get his hands on Benning. Now he had his hands on it. And what he did with it was, in the context of the American military establishment of the 1920s, close to revolutionary. The infantry school before Marshall was, like most military schools of the interwar period, organized around a specific and deeply embedded pedagogy. Officers were taught doctrine, they were taught procedures, they were taught the approved standard ways of doing things, the correct format for a written order, the standard organization of a defensive position, the established sequence of steps for planning a movement. Examinations tested whether students had absorbed the approved answers. Instructors lectured from notes that had been refined over years into something close to canonical authority. The goal was standardization, to produce officers who would, when faced with a military problem, respond in broadly the same way, in a manner that could be predicted and coordinated from above. Marshall thought this was wrong. Not just suboptimal, fundamentally, philosophically wrong in its understanding of what military leadership actually required. His conviction, rooted in years of watching both competent and incompetent officers under pressure, was that the most important thing a military officer could possess was not knowledge of doctrine or mastery of procedure. It was the ability to think clearly under pressure, about the details themselves. These were not skills that could be taught by lecturing students on approved procedures. They had to be developed through practice, through exercises that put officers in ambiguous, rapidly changing, high-pressure situations and demanded that they make decisional opposition to rebuild the infantry school around this conviction. He brought in, as faculty, officers who had distinguished themselves in actual field duty, men with current experience of what real military problems looked like, rather than men whose authority derived from their mastery of the school's established traditions. He abolished the elaborate multi-day map exercises that had been the centerpiece of advanced tactical education and replaced them with short, fast-moving problems that demanded quick, clear decisions in conditions of uncertainty. He reduced the length and complexity of the written orders that student officers were required to produce, and he hammered on one theme above all others. In his own words, get down to the essentials, make clear the real difficulties, and expunge the bunk, complications, and ponderosities. That phrase, expunge the bunk, complications, and ponderosities, is one of the most practically useful things any military educator has ever said. It is also one of the radical, because what Marshall was attacking was not merely administrative excess. He was attacking a deeply held belief that military competence was demonstrated by the complexity and thoroughness of one's planning, that more detail, more procedure, more layers of instruction meant better command. He was arguing against that consensus that the opposite was true, that the finest military orders were the shortest ones that could still accomplish their purpose, because short orders left room for the people carrying them out to think. He was also making a more subtle but equally important argument about what military officers were for. In the traditional view, an officer was a manager, the person who figured out in advance exactly what needed to be done and then told his subordinates in enough detail that they couldn't go wrong how to do it. In Marshall's view, an officer was a leader, the person who understood what needed to be achieved and why, communicated that understanding clearly to the people around him, and then trusted those people to use their own judgment, initiative, and local knowledge to actually achieve it. By the time Marshall left Fort Benning in 1932, the institution he was leaving had become, in his own phrase, the fountainhead of Army reform. Quietly, through the officers who had learned there and were spreading those ideas through their own units and commands, reshaping how the American Army thought about leadership and command. More than 200 men who would go on to become generals in the Second World War had passed through Fort Benning during Marshall's tenure. They knew what he had taught, and when the time came, they would teach it themselves. But before those ideas could be fully tested in war, the Army would first have to demonstrate, in the most brutally public and expensive way imaginable, exactly what happened when those ideas were not applied.
It's February of 1943. American forces in North Africa, their first major engagement against German forces anywhere in the world, are about to suffer the worst single defeat in the Army's experience of the Second World War. A quick sketch of the situation so the picture is clear. The Allies are pushing east through Tunisia, trying to trap German and Italian forces between their advance from the west and the British Eighth Army's advance from the east, following their victory at El Alamein. In the center of the Allied line sits the American Second Corps, fresh from the Operation Torch landings and hungry, in the way that inexperienced troops often are, to prove what they can do against a first-class. Fredendall commanded from a bunker, not a forward command post within reach of his units, an actual deeply constructed, extensively engineered bunker dug into a ravine in the Algerian hills somewhere between 80 and 100 miles behind his front lines, so elaborate with its tunnels and reinforced chambers that it had required 200 engineers working continuously for weeks to build it, engineers who were desperately needed elsewhere for combat-related tasks. The construction of Fredendall's personal fortress was, Omar Bradley later said, a source of shame for every American soldier who knew about it.
From this bunker, Fredendall managed, or attempted to manage, his corps the way a 19th-century factory owner might manage a production line. He issued orders, detailed, prescriptive, elaborate orders that reached down not to his division commanders, but to his brigade commanders, his battalion commanders, sometimes directly to company officers, 4 and 5 levels of command below where a corps general had any business reaching. His orders were famously impossible to understand. He used jargon, personal slang, and theatrical tough guy language, pull a stone wall, go smash 'em, shove him around, that communicated aggressive intent while conveying almost nothing about what he actually wanted done, or why, or how. He almost never visited the front. He relied on maps and radio. When commanders in the field, men who had actually seen the terrain and actually understood the threat developing in front of them, tried to report what they were observing and recommend how to respond, Fredendall ignored them or contradicted them. He had a picture of the situation in his bunker, derived from maps and reports, and he trusted that picture more than the judgments of the men standing in the sand. On the 14th of February 1943, the German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched their attack. The American defensive positions, which Fredendall had arranged according to his own preferences rather than according to the terrain or the advice of the officers who knew the ground, were positioned too far apart to provide mutual support. Units that came under attack could not be reinforced in time. Commanders at the front, desperate for decisions, tried to reach Fredendall. When they could reach him at all, the responses they got were at best slow and at worst incoherent. Within hours, the American line was breaking. Within days, the Second Corps had been pushed back more than 50 miles, the longest single retrograde movement in American experience of the entire European theater. German forces poured through the Kasserine Pass, sending American troops into retreat across the Tunisian plain. More than 6,000 Americans were captured, killed, or wounded. 183 tanks were lost. The humiliation was total. When American journalists began filing reports and the scope of the disaster became public, the political and institutional implications were enormous. This was the first time American forces had met German forces in sustained battle. The result had been a rout, and the question being asked in newspaper offices and in the halls of Congress and in Eisenhower's own headquarters was a simple and devastating one. Why? The answer, worked out in painful detail in the after-action reports that followed, pointed in one direction. It wasn't the soldiers. The individual American fighting men at Kasserine had, in many cases, fought with considerable courage against a tactically superior enemy who had been doing this for 3 years. The failure was not one of raw material. It was a failure of command, a failure specifically of the top-down, micromanaging, detail-obsessed command culture that Fredendall embodied, and that, until Marshall's revolution had run its full course, the Army had never fully renounced. Eisenhower relieved Fredendall. He replaced him with George Patton. And the Army, across every level of its leadership, began the painful process of learning the lessons that Kasserine was teaching. If the idea that an army can be defeated not by the enemy's weapons, but by its own command philosophy, is the kind of thing that grips you, take a moment to subscribe right now. It genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who'd appreciate them. Now, let's look at the system the Americans had been fighting against and where it actually came from, because the story has a genuinely ironic twist.
Right. Quick recap. It's 1943. The American Army has just been beaten badly at Kasserine Pass, and the failure has been traced to a command culture that prioritized control over initiative, procedure over judgment, detailed orders over independent thinking. Now let's look at the other side of that equation, because to understand what the Americans were learning to do, you first have to understand what they were trying to do it against. The German military excellence that shocked American forces in North Africa in 1943 was not an accident or a natural gift. It was the product of a specific, deliberate, and remarkably old intellectual tradition, one that had been built layer by layer over more than a century out of a catastrophic defeat that had forced the Prussian military to rethink almost everything it believed about how armies should be led.
The catastrophe was the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought in October of 1806. Prussia, then widely regarded as the inheritor of the military genius of Frederick the Great, marched its armies against Napoleon Bonaparte and was destroyed. Not pushed back, destroyed. Two Prussian armies fighting on the same day were defeated so completely and so quickly that within weeks the Prussian state had essentially ceased to function as a military power. Napoleon entered Berlin. The king fled. The fortress cities surrendered one after another. An army that had believed itself the finest in Europe turned out, against a genuinely new kind of warfare, to be a museum piece. The Prussian military reformers who undertook the task of rebuilding after that disaster, men like Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau, asked a question that cut to the core of everything. Why had Frederick's system failed so completely? And the answer they arrived at was uncomfortable because it pointed not at tactics or equipment or logistics, but at leadership culture. Frederick the Great's army had been built on the assumption that soldiers were, in essence, instruments, human machinery that should do exactly what it was told, exactly when and how it was told to do it, with no individual initiative, no personal judgment, and no deviation from orders under any circumstances. This system had worked brilliantly under Frederick himself because Frederick was a military genius who happened to be in personal command of every battle, able to adapt in real time to changing situations and issue the precise instructions his instrument required. But Frederick was dead for 20 years by the time Jena happened, and his system, without him, had become rigid, slow, and brittle, unable to respond to the speed and flexibility of Napoleonic warfare, in which French officers at every level were expected and encouraged to exercise their own initiative, exploit opportunities as they arose, and advance the overall mission without waiting for orders from above. Against that kind of warfare, an army of perfect instruments waiting for instructions was constantly one step behind, and in battle, one step behind is often enough to lose. The Prussian reformers built something completely different. Over the following decades, they developed an approach to command that has become known as Auftragstaktik, a German compound word best translated as mission tactics or mission command. The idea in its essentials was this: a commander tells his subordinates what he needs achieved and why it matters to the larger operation, and then steps back and trusts them to figure out how to achieve it, based on their own assessment of the local situation without requiring further instructions. This concept, what military theorists call the commander's intent, is deceptively simple. The senior commander says, "Here is the situation we are in. Here is the objective I need you to reach. Here is why it matters to what I'm trying to do overall." That is the order. Everything else, the route you take, the timing you choose, the way you handle the unexpected things that will inevitably happen once you leave my presence and start moving toward that objective, is left to you. You are expected to think. You are expected to adapt. You are expected to make good decisions under pressure without coming back to ask for guidance. The Prussians, and later the German army that inherited this tradition, took this philosophy and built an entire institutional culture around it. Their officer schools taught it. Their war games practiced it. Their promotion systems rewarded it. Officers who took initiative and failed were treated far more generously than officers who failed to take initiative at all, because in the Prussian and later German military worldview, the sin of doing nothing when the situation demanded action was considered worse than the sin of doing the wrong thing with good intent. The result, by the time the Second World War began, was a German military in which a young company commander in a fast-moving battle could make decisions on the spot that American equivalents were conditioned to refer upward through the chain of command. German junior officers were expected to know not just their orders, but their commander's purpose, not just what they were supposed to do, but why, and therefore what they should do instead if circumstances changed and the original plan no longer applied. This system was extraordinarily effective. It was also, as we'll see, an idea that the Germans themselves were in the process of abandoning at exactly the moment the Americans were learning to apply it. Quick recap. It's now mid-1943. American forces have been defeated at Kasserine. George Patton has replaced Fredendall in command of Second Corps, and the Army is in the middle of a painful, urgent confrontation with the question of how it trains and uses its officers. Now let's see what Patton actually did and how the lessons of Kasserine began to propagate through the force. Patton's arrival at Second Corps headquarters in early March of 1943 was by every account an event. He drove up in a staff car with sirens going and flags flying. He immediately imposed a set of disciplinary standards, proper uniform, helmets worn at all times, a visible, aggressive forward presence for officers who had grown accustomed to managing from the rear, that were in themselves less about tactics than about command culture. What Patton was doing with his trademark theatricality was making a point. The era of managing the battle from a distant bunker was over. Officers were expected to be where the fighting was. But Patton understood, and this is important, that what Second Corps needed was not simply tougher management, it needed a different kind of management. The problem at Kasserine had not been that Fredendall's officers were insufficiently obedient, it had been that they were too obedient, too conditioned to wait for orders from above, too dependent on a command system that collapsed when the man at the top was either absent, incapacitated, or simply wrong. Patton's own instinct, and it was instinct rooted in the same traditions that Marshall had been trying to instill since Benning, was to push decision-making downward. His orders, unlike Fredendall's, were short. They communicated his intent. They told his commanders what he wanted to achieve and why it mattered. They did the first significant engagement of the Tunisian campaign at El Guitar. This was not primarily a result of Patton's personal tactical brilliance, though Patton was genuinely capable at the operational level. It was a result of a corps whose officers now had a clear understanding of what their commander wanted and the latitude to go get it in the way that made most sense from where they were standing. The Army as a whole, meanwhile, was drawing its own institutional failures directly. They pointed to Fredendall's micromanagement, his distance from the front, the confusing and contradictory orders, the failure to push decision-making to the level where decisions could actually be made effectively. They pointed implicitly and sometimes explicitly at a gap between the philosophy Marshall had been developing at Benning since 1927 and the actual practice of leadership in the field. The Army's Chief of Training, General Leslie McNair, was already running a training program of unusual toughness, realistic, physically demanding, designed to produce soldiers who could think and function under conditions of genuine stress and uncertainty. After Kasserine, the emphasis on command initiative intensified. The Army's schools began explicitly teaching what the Benning Revolution had pioneered: short orders, clear intent, maximum latitude for subordinates to exercise judgment. The 5-paragraph operations order, the format that would eventually baffle that German intelligence officer in Normandy, was not an informal habit. It was a formally taught, deliberately designed system, structured specifically around the idea that a military order's job was to communicate purpose and direction, not to provide a comprehensive script for every possible contingency. And somewhere in all of this, the U.S. Army was doing something that its senior leaders understood clearly, but that would take historians decades to fully appreciate. It was borrowing from the intellectual tradition of the very enemy it was fighting. That enemy itself had inherited from the catastrophe of Jena in 1806, and it was implementing that idea more thoroughly and more effectively than the original practitioners were by 1944 able to implement it themselves.
Let's stay here for a moment, because there's something at the center of this story that deserves to be examined directly. Something that, once you see it, changes the way you understand the entire campaign. By 1944, the German military's once formidable tradition of mission command was in serious trouble. It had not been destroyed by enemy action, it had been destroyed from within, by the very leadership structure of the German state. The man at the top of that structure, the German head of state, had spent the preceding years progressively stripping away the decentralized, initiative-based command culture that had made the German military so extraordinarily effective in the early years of the war. He distrusted initiative in his generals. He had sacked, demoted, or overruled some of the most capable officers in German military history when their independent judgments conflicted with his own preferences. He had, by 1943 and 1944, constructed a system in which significant operational decisions required his personal approval, in which German commanders in the field were sometimes unable to move a reserve unit or order a tactical withdrawal without getting permission from a headquarters that was, for much of that morning, unwilling or unable to make the decision. The hours in which a fast, aggressive, decentralized German response might have driven some part of the Allied force back into the sea passed without that response. Meanwhile,
In the American forces pressing inland from those beaches, something different was happening. The American officers who led those units, from the generals down to the lieutenants commanding platoons on the sand, had been trained in the tradition that Marshall had built at Benning, refined in the fires of Tunisia, and institutionalized across the entire force in the 18 months between Kasserine and D-Day. They had clear orders, yes, but those orders were short. They communicated a mission and a direction and a purpose. They did not try to script every contingency, because the men who wrote them understood that no script would survive the first 30 seconds of contact with a defended beach. What those officers were expected to do, what they had been trained to do, drilled to do, tested on, and evaluated on, was to understand their commander's intent well enough that when their specific orders became impossible to execute, they could substitute their own judgment for those orders and still advance the overall mission. When a landing craft went left when it should have gone right, and the officer in it found himself on a beach he hadn't planned to be on, facing obstacles he hadn't briefed, with units separated from the people they were supposed to coordinate with, the expectation was that he would assess, decide, and act, not wait for updated orders that weren't coming. Act. If the idea that an army defeats itself by strangling the thinking of its own officers is the kind of history that deserves to be understood by more people, please take a moment to subscribe right now. It's genuinely why this channel exists, because what's coming next is where all of this abstract theory about orders and initiative gets tested in one of the most brutal environments of the war.
Quick recap. It's now June and July of 1944. The Allies are ashore in Normandy. The initial landings have succeeded, but the campaign is now bogged down in what the French call the Bocage, and if you want to understand what initiative-based command actually meant in practice, the Bocage is where you have to look. The Bocage was, at its simplest, a kind of countryside, a particular and ancient way of organizing agricultural land that covered most of the Normandy interior, small fields separated by raised earthen banks, often several feet thick, topped with dense tangles of roots, shrubs, and trees that had been growing for centuries. The banks themselves, the hedgerows, were not hedges in the English garden sense. They were walls. Walls of compacted earth, often 4 to 6 feet tall and just as thick, with the roots of old trees binding them into a mass that a tank could not simply drive through. When it tried, the tank would tilt upward as its front climbed the bank, exposing the thin underside armor to any weapon that happened to be waiting on the other side. Every field was a defensive position. Every hedgerow was a wall behind which a machine gun team or small group of determined soldiers could pin down an attacking unit indefinitely, and then when that unit finally worked its way around or through, simply fall back to the next hedgerow, 50 yards away, and do it again. The Bocage turned what should have been a mobile, armor-heavy advance into a grinding, close-range infantry fight that ate men and time at a rate no planner had anticipated. This was the environment in which the American command system's investment in initiative was most directly tested, because the Bocage was, by its nature, a place where no centralized plan could function. The fighting was too close, the fields too small, the visibility too limited for anyone above the platoon or company level to really understand what was happening in any particular field at any particular moment. Division commanders, brigade commanders, even battalion commanders were dealing with a patchwork of small fights, each one in its own enclosed field, each one demanding its own improvised solution. In this environment, the question of whether a platoon lieutenant trusted his own judgment, whether he'd been trained to make decisions and take responsibility for them, or trained to wait for guidance from above, was not an abstract question of command philosophy. It was the difference between a unit that kept moving and a unit that stalled. American officers in the Bocage improvised constantly and creatively. When it became clear that tanks could not punch through hedgerows safely from the front, soldiers began attaching angle iron salvaged from the beach obstacles to the fronts of their Sherman tanks, creating improvised cutters that let the tanks drive directly into a hedgerow bank and cut through it rather than climbing over it and exposing their belly armor. The first improvised versions were jury-rigged at the unit level by a sergeant named Curtis Cullen. Within days, the idea had spread laterally across multiple units. Within a week, Army Ordnance had officially adopted it and was producing the devices at scale. The whole process, from a single sergeant's idea to Army-wide adoption, took roughly a week. This was not how the German military worked in 1944.
In the German system, an innovation of that kind would have had to travel up through the chain of command for approval before it could be officially adopted. And in an atmosphere of increasing centralization and bureaucratic caution, that journey might take weeks or might never arrive at all. In the American system, the system Marshall had designed, refined at Benning, and baked into the culture of an entire army, a good idea didn't need permission to spread. It just needed people at the platoon level who were confident enough in their own judgment to try something new, and a command culture that rewarded initiative rather than punishing it. The Bocage cost the Americans enormously in blood and time. They were stuck for nearly 7 weeks after the landing, fighting for inches in a landscape that seemed designed specifically to negate every advantage of numbers and firepower they possessed. But within those 7 weeks, they were also learning, adapting, innovating at every level from Army headquarters down to the individual rifle squad, in a way that was setting up the event that would, finally, break the campaign open and reveal what the American system could really do when given room to run.
Right. Let's look at what the American command system actually looked like in practice, because this is where the abstract idea becomes concrete in a way that explains everything that follows. The operations order that had baffled the German intelligence officer in our opening, the single-page 5 short paragraphs, was not a shorthand version of something longer. It was the finished product, the complete artifact of the American planning process, designed to communicate everything that a subordinate commander needed to know to execute his mission effectively, and nothing more. Those 5 paragraphs, in the standard American format of the period, followed a consistent structure. The first described the situation, where the enemy was, what friendly forces around the unit were doing, and how the current operation fit into the larger picture. The second paragraph stated the mission, a single sentence in a specific grammatical form that told the unit what it needed to accomplish, where, when, and for what purpose. One sentence, not a page of sub-objectives and sequential tasks. One sentence that captured the entire reason the unit was being asked to do what it was being asked to do. The third paragraph, execution, was the longest, but even here, the American system was structured around Chief and how he saw the overall action unfolding. Then he listed the specific tasks assigned to each subordinate unit. Then, and this is the critical part, he identified his main effort and his key task, the single most important thing that needed to happen for the mission to succeed, the thing every subordinate needed to understand in case everything else fell apart. The fourth and fifth paragraphs covered logistics and communications, standard, brief, functional. The whole thing fit on a page because it was designed to fit on a page, because the officer who wrote it had been trained to communicate purpose and direction, trusting his subordinates to work out the details of execution themselves. What the order gave every officer who read it was not a script, it was a framework, a clear understanding of where they were in the larger battle, what they needed to accomplish, and why it mattered. Enough that when the plan stopped working and improvisation became necessary, they could improvise intelligently toward the same ultimate objective without losing coherence with everything going on around them. Compare this to the German orders of the same period, the 6 to 10-page documents that mapped out each movement in sequence, each unit's position at each phase line, each contingency addressed with a specific instruction. These documents were masterpieces of planning craft. They were also brittle, because every additional layer of specification was an additional layer of assumptions, an assumption that the unit would be where the order said it would be at the time the order said it would be there, that the enemy would respond in the way the order anticipated, that communications would function perfectly, and the map would match the ground. In the Bocage and in the brutal, fast-moving fighting that followed the breakout, none of those assumptions held. The German orders grew longer in part because German commanders were trying to compensate through more precise specification for the declining willingness of their own system to tolerate individual initiative. The more the system at the top demanded centralized control, the more it tried to address every contingency in writing, because the officers in the field couldn't be trusted to address contingencies themselves. The orders got longer as the system got more rigid, and the orders became harder to execute as the battle became more fluid. Let's pause here and make sure we have the full picture, because what we're about to watch, Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, is where everything we've been building toward gets tested in the most direct, decisive way possible.
We started with a German intelligence officer puzzled by a single page. We've traced that single page back through the Benning Revolution of 1927, through the disaster at Kasserine, through the philosophy of mission command that the Prussians invented after Jena and the Germans were now abandoning. Now let's watch what happens when the system designed to produce that single page finally gets room to move. It's the 25th of July, 1944. The Allied armies have been in Normandy for 7 weeks, grinding through the Bocage at enormous cost. General Omar Bradley, himself a product of the infantry school under Marshall, one of the 200 future generals who had learned at Benning what leadership was supposed to look like, has a plan to break the stalemate. He calls it Operation Cobra. The plan is, in its essentials, simple. A massive aerial bombardment will saturate a specific rectangular section of the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô, roughly 4 miles long and less than 2 miles deep. The bombardment is designed not merely to destroy individual German units, but to stun and disorganize the entire defensive system in that sector, to break the coherence of the German line, create a gap, and allow American armored forces to pour through before the gap can be closed. Once through the gap, those armored forces' whole concept depends on speed. Speed of exploitation after the bombing, speed of decision-making at every level of command as the situation develops faster than any plan can anticipate, speed of movement of units that will inevitably encounter unexpected situations, lose contact with adjacent units. On the morning of July 25th, roughly 1,500 heavy bombers dropped more than 3,000 tons of explosives on the German defensive sector near Saint-Lô. The bombardment was devastating, and, in one of the grimmer ironies of the day, 2 short drops of bombs fell behind American lines rather than in front of them, killing more than 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the architect of the Army's training program, who had gone forward to watch the attack. It was a painful loss on what would turn out to be a decisive day. The ground attack followed immediately. American infantry pushed into the stunned German positions. Armored units pressed behind them. And then something happened that no plan had specified, because no plan could have specified it. The German defensive system, already disorganized by the bombing and by weeks of fighting against an enemy that kept adapting, began to come apart faster than anyone had predicted. This is where the difference between 2 command philosophies became visible in real time, on the ground, in the movement of men and machines across a shattered landscape. German units in the path of the exploitation, many of them already badly battered, tried to respond. They called back to headquarters for permission to withdraw, to adjust, to counterattack. In some cases, those calls reached commanders who were themselves waiting for authorization from still higher headquarters. In some cases, the decisions that came back were already outdated by the time they arrived. In some cases, German officers who understood what needed to be done were unable to do it because the system they operated in had made unauthorized action a serious personal risk. American units, by contrast, were driving through a landscape in which the specific sequence of objectives they had been given was, in many cases, already irrelevant. The terrain was different, the German resistance was in different places, the opportunities being created by the breakthrough were not the opportunities the plan had anticipated, and at every level, from the division commander down to the tank commander in a specific field, American officers were doing what their training had prepared them to do, assessing, deciding, and acting, based on their understanding of what their commander was trying to achieve overall, without waiting for instructions about the specific situation they were currently in. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, the main effort of Operation Cobra, had given his subordinates a clear intent and a clear direction. He had not given them a script. And as the situation changed and opportunities developed faster than any script could accommodate, his units exploited those opportunities with a speed and aggression that astonished even the most optimistic Allied planners. By the end of July 25th, American forces had punched through the German line. By the 27th, the breakthrough had become a breakout. By the 31st, American units had captured Avranches and were pouring out of the Bocage into open country. In the days that followed, Patton's Third Army was activated and unleashed, driving east, west, and south simultaneously, turning the German position in France from 3 directions at once, moving so fast that the German command system, already struggling to process the pace of events, effectively ceased to function as a coordinated whole. Within 3 weeks of Operation Cobra, the German strategic position in France had collapsed. The armies that had held Normandy for nearly 2 months were in flight toward the Seine, their command structure shattered, their ability to mount coherent resistance gone. The Falaise pocket closed on a catastrophic proportion of what remained of the German armies in western France. Paris was liberated. The campaign that some Allied planners had feared might take 18 months had, from Cobra forward, taken weeks. The single page had done its work. Let's take a step back, now that we can see the full shape of the story, and ask the question that's been implicit in everything we've looked at. What exact capacity, though all of those things mattered enormously, but with an idea about human beings and what they're capable of when trusted to think? The idea that George Marshall had been working with since his years in China, and that he had spent 5 years at Fort Benning trying to build into the foundations of the American military education system, was fundamentally this: that ordinary people, given clear purpose and adequate training, can make good decisions under pressure, and that the job of a military organization is to develop that capacity rather than substitute for it. An army that trusts its junior officers to think is, in conditions of modern battle, more capable than an army that doesn't, because the fog of war does not lift for senior commanders. It falls equally on everyone. The question is not whether your plan will survive first contact with the enemy. It won't. But whether the people carrying out your plan can adapt intelligently when it doesn't. This is a harder institutional commitment than it sounds. It requires, most of all, a willingness on the part of senior officers to give up control, to write an order that fits on a single page, and then genuinely trust the people who receive it to exercise their own judgment. To accept that some of those judgments will be wrong, that initiative by its nature produces mistakes, and to treat those mistakes as the cost of a system that is overall more adaptive and more effective than the alternative. The German military tradition, at its best, had understood this completely. The Prussian reformers after Jena had built a system that genuinely cultivated initiative at every level, that specifically valued officers who acted on their own judgment over officers who waited for instructions, that understood the difference between an error of commission, doing the wrong thing while trying to do the right thing, and an error of omission, which was doing nothing when action was required. In their system, the error of omission was always the greater failure. But by 1944, that tradition had been overridden by a political structure that could not tolerate the independence it required, and so the force that had pioneered mission command ended up fighting an army that had inherited, refined, and, in some critical respects, improved upon the original idea. An army whose officers had been trained to find the mission in the order rather than the script, to understand intent as well as instruction, and to keep moving intelligently toward the objective, even when everything around them had changed. There is a quiet irony in all of this that deserves to be named directly. The United States Army, which fought its way across France and Germany between 1944 and 1945 with an operational flexibility and speed that astonished both its enemies and at times its own senior commanders, did so in part because it had borrowed, studied, and developed a set of ideas that originated in a military disaster more than a century before the war began. The Prussians rebuilt after Jena. The Germans inherited what the Prussians built. The Americans studied what the Germans had built, identified its core insight, stripped away the cultural and institutional baggage, and quietly installed it in a generation of officers trained at a school in Georgia by a man who never commanded a single combat division in the Second World War. Marshall became Chief of Staff of the entire United States Army in September of 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland. Churchill would later call him the organizer of victory, perhaps the single most important individual in the Allied war effort, though he never commanded a field army in combat, never led men into battle himself, and is far less famous today than the generals he trained and selected and placed in the commands that won the war. Bradley, Eisenhower, Ridgway, Collins, the men who executed the campaigns in North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Germany, almost all of them passed through or were shaped by the tradition Marshall had been building since 1927. The German intelligence officer who picked up that single-page American order in Normandy in July of 1944 and thought it looked like incompetence was, in a sense, looking at the whole story from the wrong end. He saw a thin document where he expected a thick one. He saw brevity where he expected elaboration. He saw 5 paragraphs where his own military culture had taught him to expect 6 to 10 pages. And he drew the natural conclusion that the Americans didn't know how to plan. What he didn't see, what no document could show him because it wasn't in any document, it was in the training and culture and habit of mind of hundreds of thousands of officers at every level of a very large army, was the 17 years of quiet, persistent intellectual effort that had produced that single page. The dead ends and the arguments and the after-action reports and the failures in the desert and the painful corrections that followed. The conviction held and driven and protected over decades by one unusually far-sighted man that the army he was building needed officers who could think, not just follow. The whole invisible infrastructure of a command philosophy that valued purpose over procedure, intent over instruction, and the judgment of the man on the ground over the plan of the man behind the map. That was what the single page contained, and by the time the German intelligence officer held it in his hands, it was already too late for his army to learn the lesson it represented.
Here is what I want you to take away from this story. In July of 1944, 2 armies met in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. One of them wrote its orders in 6 to 10 pages. The other wrote its orders on a single page. And the army with the shorter orders won, not because short orders are better than long ones in some abstract sense, but because of what the difference in length represented. It represented an investment made over 17 years in the idea that leadership cannot be scripted, that the battlefield is too complex, too fast, too unpredictable for any document, however long, however thorough, however brilliantly planned, to substitute for the judgment of the person actually on the ground. That the job of a senior commander is not to control every subordinate's action, but to give every subordinate a clear enough understanding of the purpose and direction that they can think and act intelligently on their own when, inevitably, the plan stops working and the situation changes. The man who made that investment was George Marshall. He made it at Fort Benning in 1927, at a moment when the United States Army was a skeleton standing force with no prospect of fighting a major war for years. He made it patiently, quietly, carefully, building into one class of students at a time an idea about military leadership that was so different from the prevailing consensus that he felt he had to proceed, in his own words, quietly and gradually to avoid arousing opposition. He was never famous for it. He never commanded the armies in the field that his investment produced. He spent the war in Washington, organizing, selecting, planning, coordinating the vast, invisible architecture of a war effort that is never the subject of battle histories or dramatic films. The men who led the armies to victory in Europe were his students and his protégés. The doctrine that those armies fought with was his doctrine, or the offspring of it. The short orders that puzzled the German intelligence officer in Normandy were the direct descendants of the educational philosophy he had hammered out at an infantry school in Georgia against institutional resistance more than a decade before the war began. The Bocage eventually ended. The Breakout came. The pursuit across France that followed was one of the fastest, most decisive advances in the history of warfare. An army moving faster than the enemy's command system could track, exploiting opportunities that no plan had specified, driven by officers at every level who understood not just their orders, but their purpose, and who kept moving intelligently toward that purpose, even when everything else was changing around them. A single page had started all of this. 5 paragraphs, a mission, a direction, and the confidence built over 17 years and tested in the hardest possible way that the person reading it would know what to do next. If this kind of history, the history of ideas and how they shape the world, is the kind you want more of, please take a moment to subscribe. That's genuinely the whole reason this channel exists.
And let me know in the comments, what other hidden stories from the Second World War do you want us to tell next?